So.
All right. Welcome, everybody, to the first of the 2026 Newport Bermuda Race Prep Series. My name is Andrew Kallfelz. I'm the Bermuda Race Organizing Committee Chair for the 2024 and the 2026 race. And I'm glad everyone's here to listen to this important review of what happened in 2024. Before we get into tonight's program, I'd like to introduce the Cruising Club of America Commodore Jay Gowell.
Thank you, Andrew. Good evening, everyone. As many people know, prior to 2024, only 2 vessels had been lost in the Bermuda race since its first running in 1906. Other than the loss of a crew member when a schooner caught fire and sank in 1932, there has, fortunately, been no loss of life in these sinkings. In 2024, 2 boats sank while racing, and another sank on the return voyage from Bermuda. On behalf of the Cruising Club of America, co-sponsor of the Bermuda race since 1926, I want to thank the volunteers from U.S. Sailing, the Bermuda Race Organizing Committee, and the CCA for their diligent work in reviewing what happened in the loss of these vessels during and after the race, with the goal of gaining knowledge to help prevent such losses in the future. Thank you. I look forward to hearing the results of the review.
Thanks, Commodore. I'd also like to point out that Commodore Gowell was also a Bermuda Race Organizing Committee Chair for the very lightly sailed 2020 Bermuda race. I'd like to now introduce my co-moderator, Dick York. Dick is the chair of the U.S. Sailing Safety at Sea Committee and a veteran offshore sailor himself. Dick?
Thank you, Andrew. I just wanted to talk a little bit about what's going to happen with the results of all the studies that you're going to hear about today. The first thing I would like to say is we're writing this in part for individual sailors to be able to read and understand, so I urge you to do that. The results of all the studies, the final reports, will be loaded up on the U.S. Sailing website, so you can read them there, and as well as reading a number of other good incidents reports there. Also, we're beginning to load up all these studies onto World Sailing. They've gone very hard at trying to get incident reports loaded up there. Thank you, Sally Honey, for pushing that. So you can go up there and read things too. We will fold the results into our training as appropriate. And the other thing is if we find mechanical issues we have to deal with, we'll fold them into either our safety equipment requirements, the SERs, or again, take them up to World Sailing for inclusion in the Offshore Special Regulations, the OSRs. So that's what's going to happen in the future. We have a lot of work to do, but we hope you enjoy tonight and learn a lot.
Great. Thank you, Dick. So while we're here, as Commodore Gowell mentioned, we're here to reflect on a number of the incidents that occurred in the race, and not just the sinkings. There were a number of sort of themes of incidents that occurred during this race. Obviously, some abandonments were a major theme. We had a number of rudder issues that were rudder steering issues that were a major theme. And then we also had a satellite phone communications issue that was a major theme. And those 3 areas form basically form the basis of our 3 groups that are going to be that have studied these incidents since the race. So we're going to focus on those in 3 different sections. Those will all become independent reports, as Dick mentioned. So with us tonight, we have the 3 leads from the 3 committees. I'd like to first mention Shiela McCurdy, a Cruising Club of America past Commodore, also a member of the U.S. Sailing Safety at Sea Committee, a veteran Bermuda racer, and also a member of the Bermuda Race Organizing Committee. Shiela will present first, followed by James Phyfe. James Phyfe has been our stalwart chief inspector for the Bermuda race for many cycles, is also a veteran Bermuda racer and a CCA member. And then Mark Grosby will talk about communications, satellite communications. Mark is a Bermuda Race Organizing Committee member. He was also a member of the Fleet Communications Office that dealt with the many, many incidents that the team dealt with during the 2024 race. And then behind the scenes, pulling the levers is Kate Summers. She'll be fielding the questions that you guys post in the chat if you have any for the panel that will occur after the three presentations. So as we go through, be sure to jot your questions in the YouTube live chat. Kate will feed them back to me, and we'll pose them to the group. With that, Shiela, I'd like to pass it over to you, and we can kick off the real meat of the presentation.
Thank you, Andrew. As has been alluded to, 2024 was a highly unusual year for emergency incidents that really challenged their crews. Our group focused on the lessons learned from the abandonments, the rescues, and the subsequent sinkings of 3 boats due to uncontrollable flooding. 2 were during the race, and 1 was on the return, as Commodore Gall mentioned. The race has been fortunate to have only 2 boats lost prior to 2024 over the nearly 220 years history. Now that's in comparison. That's in comparison to thousands of boats and crews that have made the passage to Bermuda and back successfully. So just keep that in perspective. Next slide, please. The race conditions meant hundreds of miles of upwind sailing and in short, choppy seas. Many of were steep and resulted in a good deal of pounding for the fleet. The flooding in these incidents, however, was due to 3 separate causes. Alliance had a rudder bearing forced out of the upper, had the rudder stock forced out of the upper rudder bearing, and a hull breach as a result of that coming adrift. Apparently, they hit something hard that caused the damage to the rudder. Gunga Din had a spreading hull damage area under the mast step. And in Solutions' case, the source was hidden from view. Apparently, the high capacity pumps of 3,000 to 4,000 gallons per hour helped both Alliance and Gunga Din by hours of time and be systematic in their responses to the flooding. These incidents show how an inconvenience, like a clogged fuel filter, can tip the balance toward an unfortunate outcome. Next slide, please. So, although the 3 boats were somewhere between 100 and 200 miles at sea, which is we would normally consider a way out there and very much in need of looking after yourself, because and so in a range where outside help would be likely be unavailable. But during the race, help came from other competitors who were within 2 hours of the distress call. Primary communications turned out to be VHF, and those were supported by AIS positions that could be seen, and the satellite communications contact with the Bermuda Race Fleet Communications Office. So this redundancy turned out to be really critical. The Alliance crew transferred to Kaylee at night and with a full moon. They went by life raft in 2 groups, 5 and 4, and they had lines rigged between Kaylee and the raft, and then the raft to Alliance. So the Alliance crew in each lot entered the raft from the transom of the J122 and disembarked on the open transom of the J-121 with a lot of help from the Kaylee crew. They found even in 3 to 4 foot seas, this was a real strenuous effort. Initially, they had hoped to put half of the crew from Alliance onto Banter, who was also standing by. But that proved too complicated, especially after the top tube of the life raft punctured, probably due to the stern ladder on Kaylee. The Gunga Din crew transferred to Desna in one group of 7 in daylight. Desna neared the raft, checked for anything in the water, because as we all know from safety at sea hands-on training, there's a lot of lines that come off of life rafts, the drogue, the tether, other lines that are packed inside. And they threw a line which was then connected to the painter, and they had to use a winch to haul in the raft, most likely due to the full water ballast under the raft. They winched them into the stern and then helped each person from the raft climb over the stern pulpit before cutting the raft loose. On solution, the skipper contacted the U.S. Coast Guard by satellite phone through a phone number he got from his brother ashore. Fortunately, since they were about 200 miles from Cape Cod, they were just within helicopter range of the airbase there. And the helicopter arrived within about 3 hours. So they had to make do over that 3 hours of time, sorting out what they were going to do next. The inquiry panel was very happy to learn that the preparation and the U.S. sailing safety at sea training by all the crews allowed for successful rescues in moderate conditions, even as the crews found themselves in unfamiliar and complex situations. We were also very aware that each skipper put the welfare of the crew before any heroic attempts to save his stricken vessel. Next slide, please. The high-capacity pumps did not save the boats, but allowed the crews time to do everything they reasonably could before rescue. There was some lack of coordination and minor missteps as the crews felt their way through extreme challenges. So we are looking at this to recommend that the safety at sea educational resources should address the communications and command responsibilities to reduce confusion. Procedurally, we recommend that offshore sailors understand the Coast Guard methods of dropping a dewatering pump and its subsequent use. Lastly, prudent sailors should inspect their fuel tanks before passage making and take the steps necessary to assure clean fuel. I want to add that those of us on the inquiry panel were pleased by how well the crews performed. The incidents simply proved what we already know, that there is risk in offshore sailing, but training, experience, and practice as a crew improve the odds of a good outcome. And so we will now build on what you know what happened at the end. That was the spoiler alert. We lost the vessels. But James Phyfe will now address the structural issues along the way on the race. James?
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you very much. Before I get started, I want to say that our investigation is still ongoing. and final conclusions have not yet been drawn. I'm going to share a window into some of the things we have learned, but nothing I say today should be considered definitive or final. Alliance was a 2007 J122 owned by Mary Martin and Eric Irwin and built in France by J Europe. The boat was well maintained and the crew was well trained. 8 of the 9 crew had participated in an international safety at sea course. They'd sailed together extensively during the previous 18 months, and the crew had experienced a similar flooding incident during a race the year before, and therefore was somewhat practiced in responding. Alliance very likely hit a submerged object shortly before 2:45 on the morning of June 23rd while in the Gulf Stream, but no one actually saw what they hit. We do know from the yellow bit tracker data that they were making about between 11 and 13 knots over the bottom at the time. As a result of the incident, the upper rudder bearing was torn from the cockpit sole, and the hull was breached forward of the lower bearing. The opening in the hull, which was just forward of the lower bearing, was consistent with an impact from ahead. Within 10 minutes or so, there were 2 emergency pumps operating with a total capacity of close to 5,000 gallons per hour. But that didn't stop the water level from rising. The 9 crew abandoned the vessel into a life raft onto the waiting K. Lee, which was a J121 owned by Jim Coggeshall. Note that at least 2 vessels diverted and were alongside during the abandonment, and many more had made ready to assist. We know that the vessel sank shortly after 05:30 that morning, because that is the last ping, if you will, that we received from the yellow bit tracker. The picture in the upper right-hand corner was taken by a passing vessel at dawn. It was probably the last sighting of Alliance before she went down. Next slide, Kate, please. Facts found. Loss of the upper rudder bearing is catastrophic. Why is that? Because in a situation where there's an intact lower bearing, keeping the stock from dropping out of the boat, the unsupported rudder shaft will thrash around and certainly could open a hole in the hull if one doesn't exist already. If you take a look at the picture in the upper right-hand corner, I know it's a little bit small, but this picture was taken about 40 minutes after the accident as they were preparing to abandon ship. You can see that the entire rudder stock has dropped by roughly 3 to 4 inches, as best we can tell. And more importantly, you can see what's left of the upper rudder bearing, the intact upper rudder bearing, in the middle of the picture, has slid down the shaft and is resting there. The mounting installation of the upper rudder bearing is critical. The mounting bolts aren't designed to be the only way to support the bearing. And we have found that many modern production boats of all types don't provide adequate lateral support for this bearing, and that has become a key takeaway for us. Per the bearing manufacturers, the mounting bolts are not designed to take the tremendous forces imposed when steering in an active seaway. The bearings are best supported if they're snug fit into the structure around them, and that structure is designed and built to effectively support the load. And I want to draw your attention to the pictures in the bottom center and the bottom right, again with apologies for their size. If you look at the picture in the bottom left center, this is a vessel where the upper bearing, we're looking up at the upper bearing, and you can see that there is a clearance all the way around the bearing, such that the only thing holding the bearing into place laterally are the 8 through-bolted mounting bolts. If you look at the picture on the right, that bearing, lower right, that bearing is snug fit into the existing structure or the adjacent structure, providing much more support alongside or laterally. Having said that, though, I want to be clear that we don't have evidence to say whether the installation was a factor in this incident. Unfortunately, the evidence is lying at the bottom of the ocean floor, but this is something we believe all boat owners should be aware of, and something that cropped up in the review of similar incidents associated with the race. Notably, this issue has become particularly germane to open cockpit builds, where the upper bearing is mounted in the cockpit sole, because the space between the lower and the upper bearings is that much smaller, and therefore the forces on the upper bearing are that much greater. At least 5 other vessels in the race suffered steering issues, from things like broken cables and shivs to fractured bearing housings, tubing right in the hull, and fractured or parted supporting structures. And I think, interestingly enough, notably, Kaylee, which was the rescuing vessel for Alliance, suffered a very similar problem with her own bearing the morning after the rescue. And that you can see a picture of her bearing after her repairs in the lower left-hand corner. The 4 screws, back one, please, Kate. The 4 screws that are countersunk into the bearing of the existing, the initial screws that held the thing in place, they believe they're through bolts, those began to shear off, and the whole thing started moving around. And only after they scavenged the boat for new fasteners and drilled these 4 new fasteners into the mounting plate, were they able to successfully arrest the motion and continue to Bermuda. Next slide, please. Okay, turning to Gunga Din. This was a 1988 Sweden Yachts 41 owned by Robert Phyfe. The boat was well built and also very well maintained. Several safety upgrades had been done in the winter before the race, and the crew had significant practice and preparation in the months leading up to the race. Early in the morning of June 24th, which I'll note is about 24 hours before the final incident occurred, the crew noticed that the staysail stay and running backstay were becoming loose, and they actually repeatedly tightened them. And this is key because although they didn't recognize it at the time, this was an early indication of what was happening to the boat. At about 02:30 on the morning of June 25th, the crew noticed water above the floorboards when one of the sleeping off-watch crew member all of a sudden had his hand submerged in a puddle. They were able to control the flooding, as Shiela mentioned, with the use of an emergency 4,500 gallon per hour electric bilge pump. They were unable, though, to locate the source of the leak for several hours. This was a long and persistent search, lasting, I believe, about 6 hours, to locate where the water was entering the boat. And it wasn't until they started to cut away the cabin furniture with a reciprocating saw, a sawzall, that they were able to locate the leak in a small compartment underneath the mast step. Crucially, the crew couldn't keep the engine running to charge the batteries due to sediment in the tank. And this is a common theme that we've heard multiple times. The constant violent motion encountered during this race stirred up sediments in the fuel tanks that caused issues with fuel systems. And Gunga Din cleaned her filters, the crew cleaned the filters several times after the incident, but were still unable to maintain adequate electricity to power the pumps. So based on that, they determined it was impossible to address the leak at sea and abandoned ship to the nearby Desna, a Tartan 37 owned by Adam Van Voorhees, at 11 o'clock that morning. We believe the vessel sank around 1630 or shortly after 1630 on June 27th, again based on signals from the tracker. Next slide. Couple things about Gunga Din that we learned. The original wing keel on this boat had been replaced with a deeper fin keel in 2004 with a similar righting moment. Fortunately, we have the design drawings and some pictures of the replacement process and know that neither the keel bolt arrangement nor the keel sump was altered during this process. But there were 2 hard groundings, one in 2019 and one in 2023. And visual inspections undertaken after each showed no structural damage. And in fact, she had never taken on water in the years prior to this incident. And I think this all provided comfort that everything was likely okay. And in fact, the vessel had been surveyed multiple times since the groundings. But it points out that a condition and pre-sale survey is not always sufficient after a potentially damaging incident like a hard grounding. When the crew cut away the cabin furniture, they found water entering beneath the mast step. They could see the water entering the hull through a spider web of cracks, but they could not access that area or even get a very good view of it. It's probable that 3 days of heavy pounding into steep seas caused the mast to virtually or literally drive itself through the weakened hull laminate and open up fissures through which the water entered. It's likely that damage from the groundings, as well as some previously unnoticed modifications made to the bottom framing grid of the boat, led to degradation over time, which in turn caused the mast step to drive itself through the hull. And if you want to flip back to the previous slide for just 1 second, I just want to point out that this picture was taken just as the vessel was being, you can actually see the life raft, it was being abandoned. And you can notice notable slack in both the headstay and the backstay, which is instructive to us. They weren't able to access the area without removing the mast step, and therefore the mast itself, which of course is impractical at sea. Back to this next slide, if you would, please. So recommendations coming out of these investigations. Again, without saying whether the bearing installation contributed to the Alliance sinking, it's worth noting that the bearings are designed to be sufficiently supported directly by the hull and deck structure and should be appropriately installed. The importance of maintenance and inspections. The U.S. Sailing has adopted a new regulation to the U.S. safety equipment requirements that requires a rudder and keel inspection. We recommend that Newport Bermuda adopt this for 2026. The importance of destructive testing and or infrared imagery after a hard grounding. It's worth pointing out that a visual inspection after a grounding is often misleading. And the only way to completely rule out structural damage is to grind back the gel coat, take core samples, or conduct infrared or ultrasound imaging. Carrying emergency water pumps. If nothing else, these pumps bought these crews time. And that, as has previously been announced in 2024, carrying a pump of this capacity will be a requirement for the 2026 race. A few other things, consideration should be given to watertight structures. This is, of course, a question of practicality, but consideration should be given to this type of structure in new builds, whether these are practical retrofits to existing vessels depends on the circumstances, but certainly some kind of cofferdam around the steering machinery that extends above the local water line and or watertight bulkheads would make a difference in these types of circumstances. Similarly, consideration should be given to whether the rudder stock should be the weak link in the system. Again, this is a hypothetical with good arguments both for and against it. But it does beg the question of whether, had Alliance's rudder stock separated outside the hull, the outcome would have been different for them. Just as an aside, the owner of Kallfelz told us that he had considered mounting the life raft in the cockpit immediately above the upper bearing, which seemed like a logical place for it from the space perspective. But in that case, the crew most likely would not have seen the sheared bolts in the upper rudder bearing, and probably wouldn't have noticed it until it was too late. Importance of cleaning the fuel tanks prior to an offshore passage. I think Shiela already addressed this. And most importantly, the training and composure of these crews prevailed, resulting in no injuries among the 25 or so sailors who were involved. And I can't stress enough how the practiced and disciplined actions of these crews most certainly led to the successful rescues without either injury or death. And so that's all I have for you, but I would like to hand it over to Mark Grosby to talk a little bit about the communications investigation.
Thank you, James. I think I got the easier of the three jobs here because most of the equipment I needed to ask questions about still exists. But I want to start for a minute on why we were looking at satellite communications through this inquiry. Portions of our course for Newport to Bermuda fall out of helicopter range. So therefore, making assistance from fellow racers is critical when we have had catastrophic incidents. There are times when boats are not within VHF range of each other and need some satellite communications to get that assistance. We proved that this year with getting using satellite communications from the communications office to Desna to get her to respond and go to the assistance of Gunga Din sooner than when she would have been in VHF range and would have made the urgency to get off the boat a little less when they finally did get there. We also 2 years ago, the BROC determined that maintaining a continuous watch of satellite and VHF communications is an essential safety practice. And after the 2002 race, where evidence of inadequate satellite watch communications occurred, decided to implement a compliance program for the 2004 race. As we all know, we had a lot of incidences in this race. So the Fleet Communications Office was busy and used a lot of satellite communications during the race. Next slide, please. I'm sorry. Back one. Okay, why are we looking at satellite communications? We looked at that one. I need the next one. Yes, that's basically we found that you don't hear us. The Fleet Communications Office initiated 48 calls to boats that we're not expecting a call regarding a safety issue. And I'll explain what safety issues are in a moment. 4 of those calls actually got answered vocally. There were 34 calls made to boats in the vicinity of an ongoing incident, and none were answered on the first try. Of the 35 compliance calls that the FCO initiated, only 9 were vocally answered. And as I indicated, the Desna Gunga Din rescue actually totally got started because of direct satellite communications. It wasn't on the first try, but we did eventually get through. Next slide, please. Okay. Okay. How we went about looking for these facts. We surveyed a selection of the boats using a cross section. We called boats that did answer the phone. We surveyed the boats that were protested by the race committee, and we also protested some of the boats that were in the incidents. These surveys were followed up with direct interviews, going over their reactions in the boat and also what occurred during the incidences. During our surveys, we asked a large number of questions about the SATCOM communications used, types, models, rates, how they used them. We asked about radio watch procedures. There was a large spread of information, particularly about race watch procedures, where pretty much the radio watch became the responsibility of the navigator, and not much of the crew was responsible to that. There was on some of the other boats, a very detailed program that was checked on a regular basis to ensure that the satellite communication system was active, was up and running, and would be and was ready to receive a telephone call. All of our responses felt that the equipment they used or that the plan they had little or no issues calling out. So that the which equipment used did not have impact on boats' ability to call out to um, um, to other boats or to us, but we weren't just able to get going. We also found that the Iridium Go, which was a very common unit for a lot of the boats, has some issues with connection between the satellite communicator and the handset, whether it's an iPhone or a Iridium. And I didn't put it in the slide, but I would recommend to anybody who's using the Iridium Go to go on the Predict Wind website, where they have a multi-page troubleshooting guide about connections and bad sound on their using Iridium Go to communicate. Some of the factors were in that deal not with the Iridium Go, but with the iPhone or with your Android phone, trying to seek other Wi-Fi connections to get internet access when the Iridium Go isn't connected. Let's go to recommendations, please. We need to highlight a need for a radio watch at safety at sea sessions. I think more people on the boats need to be made aware of how we're using the radio watch from the FCO, and that to get more crew members trained in how to use the satellite system. Just a quick little side note that I learned today: even though an Iridium Go can accept up to five Wi-Fi connection, they recommend that only one connection be used at a time when you're communicating with the Iridium, because multiple users tends to make the device drop off the Wi-Fi or not have good connections. We would like to work with equipment manufacturers to see if we can wait to develop louder or visual alerts for incoming calls. We want to recommend that when you're using a system that has a dedicated handset, a wireless handset, that it be dedicated to the purpose. And we have a whole bunch of recommendations on what you should do to your iPhone or your Android phone to make sure those connections stay connected. We would recommend that SATCOMs should be checked at least on every watch for readiness to receive calls. The Cruising Club of America's Safety at Sea Committee just has recently done a testing of Starlink on the Atlantic coast and found it to work very effectively, other than its power use. And we're monitoring new developments in the Starlink cell phone direct connection. If one last thing on dedicated handsets, such as an iPhone 2 and Iridium Go, in the 2022 race, it was my understanding that on one of the incidences where the gentleman fell overboard, it was his iPhone that was used for the connection to the Iridium Go, and it had its password still locked, and it hadn't written it down anywhere, so the crew couldn't get onto the system through his phone because they didn't have the password to connect. So we would recommend that if you're having an iPhone dedicated to the Iridium Go, don't have a password, get rid of all the other Wi-Fi networks, and turn on the LED flash system, that where you have an incoming phone, the flashlight on your iPhone or Android will start blinking to let you know you have a call. And with that, I'll turn it back to Andrew for the discussion.
Thank you, Mark and Sheila and James. And I want to also issue a huge thank you to all of the members of the incident review committees. They've all put in many, many hours to doing the research, the interviews, and preparing the reports. It's all volunteer time, and they're passionate about making sure that we get the message out to the community. So thank you all for that. At this time, I think we're going to have a little panel discussion. I think I prepared some questions. I know Dick has prepared some questions, and we're happy to take questions if anybody puts them in the chat. To kick it off, I wanted to just make a clarification, because in the chat we did get notice from some of the Alliance crew. I think, Sheila, on your discussion of the transfers from the sinking boats to the rescuing boats, it was Alliance that ended up transferring their whole crew in one load in the raft. And it was the Gunga Din crew who decided to tether back and forth and do two tethered loads, half and half, to Desna. So I just wanted to clarify that. I think it was correct in the report. I think perhaps it was just a moment of confusion on the slides as you were trying to get through that material. I would like to kick it off with a question to Sheila about abandonment decision-making. And I prepared this question, so you guys will forgive me if I just read it the way I prepared it. There's an oft-repeated rule to step up into the life raft, i.e. don't abandon a floating boat. In the case of Gunga Din and Solution, the boats apparently didn't sink for a few days after rescue. What do these incidents tell us about the applicability of that guidance to stay on board the yacht until its imminent sinking?
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for the correction. My apologies on that. I think that stepping up into a life raft has always assumed that there was nobody around. That it's better to, of course, it's better to stay on a boat, that a bigger platform, than get into a smaller raft, if at all possible. I think what these incidents showed, though, was that if you have safe rescue standing by, and you have really good reason to understand after hours of trying to address a flooding issue or some other catastrophic failure, that there's no reason to wait to the end. Get off while it's safe, while it can be organized, if it can be in daylight, if it can be in better weather, if and that you're not meaning you're not requiring another vessel to hang around until you have to step up into the life raft. We know once to use a Coast Guard example, if a Coast Guard vessel comes after a Mayday, you have declared that you have an imminent loss, threat to life, or the loss of a vessel. And they come to pick you up, not to watch you tend your vessel to the end. They will bring a pump, as we know from the Solution episode, but they're not that helicopter. If you don't gonna get on it, it's gonna go home, and then you are increasing the danger of injury or death of crew, and it's just prudent to save lives rather than personal property.
Right. I think the through line between what the smart skippers did to abandon their boats and that old saying is that it's all about protecting the life of the crew. It's not about the asset. And depending upon the scenario, that decision is made imminently upon available rescue, not imminently upon you having to step into your boat or your raft because it's the only option. So I think that's great. Dick, do you have a question to pose?
Yeah, I'll pitch this one to Sheila also. And I was on the committee that studied these abandonments. But I was wondering if we've summarized and analyzed and all that other kind of stuff, but there have to be just a couple good ideas that the crew that were on those boats had, and suggestions. So if I'm ever in a case where I have to get off my boat and go in the raft to be rescued by somebody, are there any nice little short strokes I should know about?
Oh, I think, well, when the full reports become available, there are all sorts of lessons learned in there that we are only touching on in the briefest sort of way. I think on Gunga Din, for instance, they had that high capacity pump, but they had put a flat hose on it in order for storage purposes. And they found out that when they started the pump below and led that hose up and over the companionway and in and out of the cabin, there wasn't enough pressure from the hose to keep the pump to keep the hose open. So they had a kink when it went over the companionway lip. There was a doctor on board who suggested they put a stent in it, and they had a section of 1-inch rigid plastic hose that they slipped inside the flat hose, and it worked like a charm. I think that was really impressive under the circumstances. Again, they had the time to do it because of their pumping capacity. Did you have another one you were thinking of? I'll turn it back to you.
Oh, okay. Well, there's a number of them, but Mary Martin on Alliance said, gee, she wished she had brought a toothbrush as she got off at the dock about 82 hours after she boarded Kaylee. So I've just dumped a toothbrush in my grab bag. Andrew, back to you.
Got it. Another one that I sort of prepared in advance, and it's sort of two related questions. I'll fold them into one. I found it curious that both Alliance and Gunga Din independently decided to transfer into their rafts to facilitate rescue by the rescuing boats. As a safety at sea moderator yourself, is the topic of rescue by another yacht discussed in the curriculum? And what, if any, other methods of yacht-to-yacht transfer might be covered or considered? Because they both came to it independently, and I don't remember the last time. I remember the last time I took the course, we didn't really cover yacht-to-yacht transfer, how to get out of your raft.
I think that's a really good point, and it has not been in the curriculum. We tend to think of the Coast Guard coming to our rescue and turning it all over to the professionals, but we definitely will be covering how a non-professional crew should prepare to pick up a fellow race crew, or on the rally, various cruising rallies and things like that. Because we have these groups of boats going across oceans within a few hours of each other, that is, and VHF range, that is often the first and best response. And yes, we will be covering that. There's a question about, who takes charge of it. You have two independent boats, each with a skipper, and you're merging those crews into one boat. So at what point does the command of the situation move to the rescuing boat? And I think that's something that we will be addressing in the near future.
Yeah, I think interesting follow-up point there is the Coast Guard rescued Solution, but I believe there was another boat nearby that would also have been in the standby rescuing position had the Coast Guard not been able to make that rescue. For instance, they were another 70 miles off the coast of the Cape. I think we would have had 3 yacht rescues and one race and return. So yeah, it seems to be a really important part to add to the curriculum because that's probably your most likely scenario.
Looks like Dick has a comment.
James, I have a question. So I'm sitting here almost ready to launch my boat, and I'm really worried about this upper rudder bearing. What should I be looking for in my boat when I dive down there and look underneath the mounting area for the upper rudder bearing?
Well, I think the investigation has taught us that this is a area of the boat that is often out of sight and out of mind. And I think just bringing visibility to these issues is going to be very important. When you look at the upper rudder bearing from beneath, be it either below the cockpit sole if it's an open transom boat, or like your boat or mine, Dick, in the helmsman seat there, you really want to make sure that the bearing itself, the vertical walls of the cylinder, are supported adequately by the surrounding hull structure or deck structure, such that the bearing is not floating in a otherwise open hole and only supported by the through bolts that are put forward by the manufacturer. We spoke with the representative of DEFA Bearings and some others, and they were very clear that those bolts are not intended to take all that lateral force. And we saw multiple indications of where they became loose, sheared, or permutations of the above. And so as a prudent boat owner, I think it behooves all of us just to take a look and see what's there, and then address it as appropriate.
Thank you.
James, I have one for you as well. It's sort of related. I think partly because of the incidents that occurred in the Bermuda race, and the adrift rudder bearings was not just an issue with Kylie. It was an issue with a number of other boats and possibly played a role in the Alliance situation as well. We don't know. If owners, so those incidents are motivating the new SER rule for keel and rudder structural inspection. What guidance is the SER going to provide to give the owners the tools they need to observe their bearing and know whether it's designed properly, installed properly? Is there going to be any guidance, that either is going to be provided in the SER as support or provided by your recommendation as support?
There is some guidance in the SER requirement that has been put into place. I am fortunate in that I sit on that committee as well. And I'm the first to say, and I think all my committee members would agree with me, that this is not a perfect solution to the problem. What the purpose of this new requirement is just to make sure that a qualified person or the owner has looked at these areas and has a short list of what to look for and where to start asking questions should things not look right. There is an appendix to the SER that establishes some common problems to look for, as well as a general checklist of good hygiene. But this is not something that requires a professional survey or any kind of destructive testing or anything like that. We want to draw attention to the fact that these are issues, and we want to encourage boat owners and professionals out there to have a look before a boat like this heads offshore.
Somewhat related, did the committee look at the recommended service intervals that are provided by either the steering system manufacturers or boat manufacturers? You're going to put something in the SER, but there's actually some service requirements recommended service intervals from the manufacturers. What do we learn about those?
Well, I think it's important to distinguish that the committee is not stepping into the shoes of the manufacturer, and the manufacturer has well thought out recommendations for maintenance of their specific bearings. We did learn, somewhat surprisingly to me, that Jeffa Bearings asks or recommends that you drop the rudder out of the boat and have a good look at the bearing and clean it up once every 3 years, which is something I don't think is done with common practice. It's certainly something I, as a boat owner, had not done in the past, but it's certainly something I will do in the future. But to answer the question, we do not make specific recommendations as to service intervals. We leave that to the judgment of the manufacturer.
One of the points you put in the recommendations was a possible design consideration of making the rudder stock be the weak link in the system. And I think by that you mean make the rudder stock weaker under the hull than it is up inside the hull. In other words, if you have an event, you want the breakage to be the rudder cleanly breaking off below the lower bearing. And I think you mentioned in your slides that in the situation of Alliance, the upper rudder bearing tearing loose became a fatal problem because it resulted in the lower bearing tearing out. Is the implication of your consideration there that these upper rudder bearings becoming adrift and detaching from the vessel are almost impossible to recover from?
Yes, that is the implication, only because it is not a situation where when you have the rudder stock still in the boat and the rudder or some portion of the rudder still underneath the boat, it's not a situation where you can spread a collision mat or something and try to stop the ingress of water. Likewise, with the violent motion going on down there, trying to get hands in there to disconnect the quadrant or do something similar would be fatal to your hands, certainly. And so, as I pointed out in the slide, I do not want to say that it is a committee recommendation that there be a weak link in the rudder. I think that that is something that professional naval architects do consider, and I think there is many opinions for it or recommendations for it as there are against it. But should that happen, whether it be inside the boat or outside the boat, obviously if it were to happen outside the boat, you would maintain the watertight integrity of the hull, which would be your immediate problem. But if it were to happen inside the boat and the thing were to drop out, you at least would have a remedy to try to plug the hole or get a collision mat over it or something like that. But again, we are not making a recommendation that be implemented. We just are making a recommendation that it be considered.
Got it. Understood. I would like to point out that there are a number of questions that popped up on the chat, and I'd like to get to them, but I want to make sure that we ask a couple questions about comms. So I had a quick one for Mark. First, I did want to make one correction. We didn't protest any incident boats. I think that was just a misspoken word there. You interviewed a number of the incident boats about their comms, which is great. Was there any evidence that calls were never properly routed by the service provider? And I guess what I'm getting at is, in the lack of connection to the target boat, did you guys conclude that it was likely all about how the target boat answered the call as opposed to the call not being routed properly by, unreliability of the constellation or the service provider?
There were occasions where when you placed the call, it did not get answered by the service and did not go to email. So
Voicemail, yeah.
A voicemail. So I can't tell you definitively whether our call was ringing on the boat and just didn't get heard, which would lead me to believe it should have gone to voicemail if it had been set up correctly. And that's the other note. As part of the compliance, we sat, or I should say, Joe Cooper sat and answered SAT calls from all the boats prior to the race. And there was a great deal of confusion by the owners on how to use their SAT phones and what to call from and what number to put on our system that made us follow up with a lot of the boats, whether it was the owner or the person in charge. So there were times where we had real doubts about the competency of some of the people who were trying to use the systems on their boat. And we really think that when you put the system on the boat, you really should be using it more than just this race.
Understood. Thanks, Mark. Dick, do you have any further questions?
No, why don't you go to the audience? That'd be great.
Yeah, we're right up against our 8 o'clock limit here. One of the slides mentioned the use of a cofferdam. I guess is to James. Would you briefly expand on this? Is it focused only on construction, design, or construction, or is this something that could be jury-rigged during an incident?
No, it is. I suppose anything is possible, but no, this would be a design implication or a design recommendation that would have to be accommodated in the steering system, such that, for instance, the quadrant would have to be above that. So it would be a very hard retrofit to an existing vessel, but it is something that is designed, I've been told, into some of the newer vessels, and it is certainly a possibility.
Got it. Thank you. I think we've got time for one more. This one is going to be for Shiela and Dick, who are on the abandonment and rescue side. Question, what happened to the life rafts after transfer? Were they brought aboard the rescuing vessels or were they abandoned?
I can take that. Yes, they were abandoned.
I think what he meant was, were they abandoned afloat? Like, were they left at sea?
There was the one that had the top tube punctured, and I believe they tried to deflate it more, but when you realize that these are, after all, rubber rafts that are not ballasted and do not sink, it's very likely that it will stay afloat. The Alliance one, there was an EPIRB in the life raft, so I know of that one because we came by several hours later and saw the AIS from the EPIRB, and we're headed over that way when we actually had a boat between us and the life raft that went to look first. And then, so we ended up sending out something of a security to all the boats in the area on VHF, saying that we had inspected it and to relay that security so that it wasn't attracting more attention. But it is common practice to leave the life raft.
That's great. I think we're pretty much out of time. There were a couple other questions that were posted. I'll see what we can do to get those answered and at least answers back to those who posted them. Thanks very much for that. I want to thank everyone who joined the webinar tonight. Again, thanks to the panel, thanks to the committees. And I believe Kate was going to push up a slide showing briefly what our next couple of webinars are. This obviously one focused on 2024 and focused on the community's ability to learn from these incidents. The next 4 sessions are really focused on how to prepare for the 2026 race. I hope you'll join us. I believe the next one's on March 26th. If you got the notice for this one, you'll certainly get the notice for the next ones because we will bombard you via the same mailing list. Thanks again for everyone's participation, and we'll catch you next time.